Sketchy go ichie.
All right. Pop culture portraits, Blade this time for Black History Month. And here's the funny thing about Blade. And so the movie came out in, I want to say it was 98, somewhere in that range. And at that time, there was this really sort of like dark, sort of noir, kind of comic flavored, how best to really put it? Like there was this really sort of like, I don't know, it wasn't dystopian, but there was this really sort of cool, edgy period in film, especially as it related to comic book properties. And a lot of the darkness was from, there really weren't a lot of really great comic book movies. We've been spoiled in the last couple of decades with all the great Marvel stuff and some select DC films. And what we fail to realize is at that point in time, there was like pretty much Blade, The Matrix, maybe Dark City. There are a couple of things that have a sort of comic book feel. And then in prior decades, of course, there was Superman and, you know, and the Tim Burton Batman. But there wasn't a lot of like really phenomenal comic book movies. And the reason I'm choosing to highlight this particular drawing of Wesley Snipes as Blade is because I want to sort of, in honor of Black History Month, sort of highlight the fact that Blade was super influential as a film at the time. And for lack of a better way to say it, like Wesley Snipes as a black leading man was a significant thing at that time. In particular, a comic book character. And this is a Marvel comic book character, Blade. I don't know who invented him. It's probably like, you know, someone in the 70s or 80s, maybe Gene Colan or someone like that back in that era. Kids, go back and Google Gene Colan. But here's the key, though. Like, Wesley Snipes was so dynamic and had so much charisma that basically he, you know, ushered in this era that made it possible, I think, possible for film companies to realize that a comic book property would work as a large-scale movie. And for those who haven't seen it, it's a phenomenal movie. I mean, again, it's probably a touch dated. You know, technology was different then. You know, obviously, we were forced to do a lot of practical effects, and there was very little CG. And the CG that they had back then was, you know, it was challenging. I mean, it was challenging for them. They didn't have the computing power that we have now. But the movie itself was great. And again, Wesley Snipes, who I'm rendering here, was the catalyst. I mean, he was a star, you know, and the way he played the character and the way the story unfolded was phenomenal. And I really think that, I mean, I'm sure it was a hit. I started the movies when I was a kid, but on the scale of a Black Panther, no, you know. So when you think of Black history and you think of like cultural relevance, and you think of that time period, again, that sort of dark, sort of noirish time period with films, especially as they relate to sort of fantasy, I think this, like, it's underrated and it's not acknowledged. And I think that's kind of the point of Black History Month, is to acknowledge excellence in the Black community as it relates to culture and the arts and things that happen in society. And I think this movie, and this is a subtle thing, and I don't know if people pick up on it, whenever there's something that's really successful like this that crosses over, like the film Blade and Wesley Snipes' performance, it crosses over into sort of a universal vein. It serves to usher in an acceptance, a level of acceptance that happens in the culture at large. So a movie like this, which is an action flick, which has got vampires in it, and it's got, it's an R-rated movie. I mean, that could be what maybe hindered some of its success because, you know, of course, the great new Marvel movies are all sort of PG rated. They're a little more family friendly. And this was really like aggressively an R-rated film. not necessarily for kids. And no, definitely not for kids, not even necessarily. But what it does though is, again, there's a universality that happens when folks from different cultures can see a black leading man in a performance that you want to root for. I think it subtly changes the dynamic of people feeling that person over there is a little bit less than when you see them as a hero. And conversely, there's also this thing that happens for the community, the black community, where you see yourself portrayed in a heroic manner, and you can aspire for greatness. So I know it's a little heavy for a how-to art video, which I've kind of neglected thus far. How to. Again, I've done a number of these pop culture portraits, so you can go back and see some of the old ones. Of course, I get into the details of the technique and what brush I use and, what program and all that stuff and the mindset that goes into making these. But the reality is this. You have to, of course, have great reference. You're going to hear that in every one of those videos that you go back and watch. Of course, you have to capture the likeness. You're also going to hear that in every single one. But there's an inspirational quality to it. Of course, the selection of the subject matter is like number one. I mean, I feel pretty confident, and hopefully this doesn't sound like I'm trying to inflate my own ego, but I'm pretty confident I can render any person. If you give me a photograph of them, I'm confident I can render any person. So if that's the case, then it's all about what inspires me. What do I want to render? What kind of gets the juices flowing? And in this case, for me to want to render Wesley Snipes as Blade, it was pure like nostalgia, purely like me trying to like get myself back into that era, that late 90s era, that Matrix, that Blade, those comic book movies before Spider-Man came out, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man came out, where people started to realize, what comic book movies are like. This is the thing. This could make us a gang of money, and this could inspire other generations, future generations of children. And I think about like myself as a kid. Like me and millions of other artists were deeply inspired by the films of the late 70s, early 80s. When you think about, like, for example, Star Wars. I mean, think about the cultural relevance of a film like Star Wars. I feel like there's probably a generation of kids who had watched, Blade and The Matrix and movies of that ilk and decided, what? I want to create that type of art. I want to do things that are dynamic. I want to use that as my influence base. And so for me, this was my nostalgic period. I think at that point in my career, I'd already started becoming a professional artist. But the visual language that was being done at that time definitely influenced a lot of artists. And there was a period in comic books at that time too, which was like essentially, artists sort of doing these sort of like dark anti-heroes. That's probably the best way to describe it. It wasn't until Marvel kind of really took hold and you've got light, vibrant heroes. And so anyways, I think Wesley Snipes, again, became a star, was a star, but really cemented himself and created a role that was iconic. And I'm just amazed that it's not as talked about on how influential his role, that movie, and that time period was on pop culture at large. But anyways, so I didn't talk much about the art. Again, you can watch all my previous videos to kind of get a real sense of how I draw and how I do things. And the fact remains that if you want to get really, really great at art, it is about working with what inspires you and selecting the images that help to support that, and then trying to be as creative as possible. And as you can see here, I'm really trying my best to kind of like add as much flavor to this line art drawing on top of a photograph that was sort of photoshopped, and then using those inspirations and combining all of it into a nice gumbo and making something interesting as an original piece of art after the fact. All right. Speaking of after the fact, Let me close the book on this one. Wesley Snipes as Blade, Pop Culture Portraits. Make sure you do this, guys. You really do. You gotta click that like button. Smash it, as they say. Subscribe. Definitely hit that bell icon if you want to be notified when I do some new videos. And trust me, some of them will be about art. Sketchy, go ichie. Live your moment. Happy sketching, y'all. Peace.